So this lesson is about respiratory system exchange surfaces. We're still in Unit 1, it is now Topic 3. A small reminder, we are really focusing here on explaining structural features with exchange surfaces for the respiratory system, not the circulatory system, which you can see here. And just another little reminder that sometimes when we're discussing breathing and you start thinking about how you're breathing, it can actually start to get really shallow and a little off rhythm, so just be mindful. Okay, so ventilation is the inhalation and exhalation of air from the outside world into your lungs, and we sometimes refer to this as respiration. But that name's kind of already taken by biology with cellular respiration, so I'm going to try and avoid using that term just to save some confusion. So gas exchange occurs during ventilation in tiny little chambers inside the lungs called alveoli, and this is where oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse along their concentration gradient eventually into the bloodstream. So the intake of oxygen can be used for cellular respiration to produce energy, which is, has a byproduct of carbon dioxide, and this is the gas exchange. So we want to remove the CO2 from our system and bring in the oxygen, and that oxygen has to enter into the tissues, so via the alveoli and then into the bloodstream, and the CO2 must be removed from it because that is our waste product. Now, the anatomy of the respiratory system includes the mouth, the nose, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the lung, and the alveoli within the lungs there. So the mouth, the nose, it's there to breathe things in, obviously. It's got to moisturize, essentially. It's got to have a bit of moisture in it and a bit of hair there as well on the nose to trap dust and foreign particles. The trachea is like cartilage rings all the way down. It's got to keep that airway open as well, and there's some smooth muscle in there as well to help cough things up or move things up if they don't need to be there. The bronchi are the two main branches off the trachea. One of them goes into each lung, obviously, and they've got these smooth muscles in the walls. Then there's bronchioles, which are like the smaller branches. Our tree is getting smaller branches, then into the lungs, and then those lungs are quite large. One of them has 3 lobes, one of them has 2 lobes. Right? The left side has 2 lobes because the heart's kind of in the way, taking up a bit of space. They're filled with these tiny little air sacs known as alveoli, and this is where at the capillaries, very small blood vessels, that's where the gas exchange is happening. There are muscles all the way through this system. Your diaphragm sits underneath your lungs and the inside the abs as well, and the ribs, between the ribs, and we'll talk more about these later about how they're helping this system. So the lungs are really large and they take up a really sizable chunk of the thorax, which is the area between the neck and the abdomen, essentially the chest cavity. Okay, the lungs are segmented into smaller sections known as lobes, and that allows them to be damaged or diseased and then removed if possible without compromising the entire lung. So the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2, and this is because the heart is slightly left of center in the thorax. And inside all of these lungs, we're talking tiny little air sacs, little chambers where that gas exchange occurs via the capillaries. Alveoli, we sometimes refer to them as little bunches of grapes, right? They're structures at the end of those bronchioles, and alveoli comes from a Latin word that means little cavity, and essentially that's what they are. So this is where that gas exchange occurs via diffusion, so a passive process. Oxygen is coming essentially into the lungs and then into the bloodstream, and we're trying to get carbon dioxide out. So they must diffuse through the cell walls of the capillaries first, and then we've got to get them into the bloodstream, be carried around by those red blood cells, and vice versa. So that gas exchange still has to happen across multiple membrane spaces there, okay? Now there's a huge number of these tiny little chambers inside the lungs, which means we're increasing the surface area for that gas exchange to be happening. These are the gas exchange surfaces we've been talking about. Instead of like having lungs like one big balloon, we're talking lots and lots of tiny ones to increase that surface area. There are 2 kinds of alveoli, right? There's 2 kinds of main cells called pneumocytes that make up these alveoli. So type 1 pneumocytes make up most of the wall of the alveoli, and they're in this single layer all the way around. They're extremely flat, extremely thin, and they run up against the capillary, which also has a very singular layer of cells. So really, we're talking like half a micrometer apart. So because this diffusion distance is really, really tiny, gas exchange can happen really, really fast at the thin wall of the alveoli and increases that rate of exchange. There are also type 2 pneumocytes. They're round, they take up only a little bit of space, about 5% of the alveoli, and what they do is secrete fluid which coats the inside of the alveoli, which has a surfactant in it, and it's going to allow that oxygen or carbon dioxide to dissolve and diffuse. So carbon dioxide can evaporate into the air when exchanged from the bloodstream into this fluid, and surfactant is super important to keep those alveoli also open. Okay, it makes a little layer on the surface of the moisture lining of the alveoli. It looks like a membrane layer essentially, and it's there to decrease surface tension so the water molecules don't all stick together. If this happens, then the alveoli can actually collapse on themselves like a deflated balloon, and premature babies don't have any cells that can make surfactant yet, so lungs can collapse more easily, and they can't do that oxygen exchange. So microscopic images show that most of the area in the lungs is just empty space, right? Given that the alveoli space is just like that, there has to be room for that air to come in from the bronchioles, and it has to be funneled somewhere, so it has to go into these tiny little chambers. Now, premature babies, I said that before, have less surfactant. They're really, really prone to collapse lungs. And if we look at a microscopy image there with the collapsed alveoli, there is far less space for the oxygen to be going in and far less exchange surfaces available. Now, the particle model in physics shows that if you actually decrease the volume for the same amount of particles, the pressure increases, right? So the same applies in the chest during gas exchange. Gas particles want to move somewhere where they can be at lower pressure. So we've mentioned that the thorax is the space between the neck and the abdomen. It's mainly containing the lungs and the heart. So the pressure of the gases in that thorax rely on the movement of the diaphragm, that muscle underneath the lungs, and the intercostals between the ribs. So if the diaphragm contracts, it's going to decrease the pressure, okay? And therefore air is going to flood in, and vice versa. When the diaphragm relaxes, it actually pushes up and that air can flood out of your lungs. The diaphragm sits directly below the lungs, and its job, like that what we just said there, it's to change the pressure inside the lungs and get the air flowing in and out. But we've also got all these other muscles as well, and they're called intercostals, okay, and they help with that pressure change. And these are antagonistic muscles, and they work against one another, okay? So just like your biceps and your triceps, intercostal muscles work like that. They are internal and external intercostals, so all those muscles around your ribs, and they will also contribute to that change of pressure in the thorax. So they only work in one direction. When one relaxes, the other is contracting, and vice versa. So they need to have partner muscles to do the job. When we inhale, our diaphragm contracts down. I'll put this little diagram up. When we inhale, our diaphragm contracts and moves down, and then our abs relax and push up. So try clenching your abs. They move inwards so that they won't help to increase the space of the thorax. But when we breathe in, our external rib muscles must contract and therefore shorten and pull the ribs closer and move outwards, okay? So because our internal rib muscles must relax to go with the movement of the externals, when we exhale through our diaphragm, it relaxes and moves upwards, okay? Our abs contract, move downwards. There's a lot happening, and I would recommend going through this really, really slowly and trying it yourself with your own physiology, but don't forget to try and breathe regularly. So obviously intake of oxygen is absolutely vital for continued functioning of every single cell. So our respiratory system has to be incredibly fine-tuned, but the more finely tuned it is, the more things that can go wrong. So we can have obstructions blocking passages, we can have smooth muscle tightening around the trachea due to allergens, the alveoli space can fill up with water or mucus, or our lungs can be punctured, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong here. Lung cancer is extremely common, and just like any other cancer, it can be caused by a chemical or radioactive mutagen. Smoking and now also vaping can cause most cases due to a mutagenic chemical that's being inhaled. Passive smoking, right, same kind of thing there. You're just inhaling secondhand smoke. or vape, whatever, and also accounts for some cases, as does air pollution, interestingly enough. Some lung cancers can be caused by asbestos or silica, which are tiny little particles in dust used for construction, and these types of cancers are incredibly difficult to treat. So lung cancer can then spread, it can metastasize and go throughout the body because it's got really easy access to the bloodstream, and it's really challenging if tumours need to be removed because of all these delicate tissues in and around the lungs. Emphysema is pretty common. It's caused by smoking, and it's essentially breaking up those little alveoli, bunch of grapes. They become enlarged and thick-walled, and therefore you're going to have fewer tiny chambers, and they're going to be less elastic. So you're going to lose the ability for them to be useful surface area available for gas exchange. So you're going to end up with shortness of breath and low oxygen levels and high CO2 levels because that waste product can't be removed. So this damage is reversible. So it is a chronic disease that will stay. You cannot fix the problems that come with emphysema, unfortunately. So this one is all about structure and function, all right? And that's the important part of this particular first dot point.